They thought he was just a gardener, but that morning he was about to witness who truly deserved to be feared and who deserved to be protected. Rain tapped softly against the glass walls of the Vance estate, turning the sprawling backyard into a blurred painting of gray and green, and Adrian Vance stood in the middle of it all, his hands wrapped around a rusted pair of pruning shears, his tailored past buried beneath a worn canvas jacket that smelled faintly of soil and rainwater. No one looking twice at the quiet man trimming hedges along the stone path. And that was exactly how he wanted it, because power, real power, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it watched, sometimes it waited, and sometimes it hid in plain sight to see who people really were when they believed no one important was watching. From where he stood, he could see through the tall kitchen windows, where Lena Brooks moved silently between counters, her dark curls pulled back neatly, her posture straight despite the weight of a long morning, her hands steady as she prepared breakfast for two small children who sat at the island, their feet swinging above the marble floor, their laughter soft but rare, as if joy was something they had learned to ration. And Adrian noticed something else too, something that didn't belong in a house this grand. The way both children glanced toward the hallway every few seconds, as if expecting a storm to walk in wearing heels. It didn't take long. Vanessa Hale appeared like a shift in the air itself, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, her presence cutting through the room without raising her voice, and yet everything grew quieter, colder, more careful. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her eyes did the work, scanning the table, the plates, the children, and finally settling on Lena with a kind of polished disappointment that felt heavier than anger. "Is this how you present breakfast?" she asked, her tone smooth. Almost bored, and Lena didn't flinch, didn't defend herself. She simply adjusted a napkin, gently sliding a glass of orange juice closer to the little girl, Mila, who reached for her instinctively. Not for Vanessa, not for anyone else, just for her, and Adrian's grip tightened slightly around the shears, not from anger, but from recognition, because children never lied about. Well, they felt safe. Ethan, the older one, spoke quietly, asking if they could eat outside later, and Vanessa didn't answer him. Not directly. She answered Lena instead. "Make sure they're finished in 10 minutes. We have plans." Plans she didn't explain, plans that didn't include the warmth that should have lived in a home like this. And Lena nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, ma'am." But her eyes lingered on the children just a fraction longer than necessary, a silent promise passing between them, and Adrian saw it. He saw everything, the invisible threads that held that room together, and the one person who was quietly carrying all the weight without ever being acknowledged. He turned back to the hedges, clipping a branch with careful precision, but his attention never left the window, because something in that room didn't sit right, something beneath the surface, something that made a powerful man choose dirt over marble just to understand it. And as the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, Adrian Vance realized that whatever truth he had come here to find, it wasn't hidden in accounts or alliances. It was standing right there in plain sight, wearing a simple uniform, protecting two children who didn't even belong to her. And for the first time since he stepped into his own house as a stranger, he began to wonder if the real danger wasn't outside his walls, but already living inside them. Adrian had learned long ago that truth rarely announced itself loudly. It revealed itself in patterns, in small repetitions that most people ignored. And as the morning stretched in a late afternoon, he began to see those patterns take shape inside his own home. Not as the man who owned it, but as the man no one noticed, the one pushing a wheelbarrow across damp grass, the one wiping mud from stone steps while conversations unfolded just beyond reach. And that distance gave him something power. Never could perspective. By noon, the rain had thinned into a mist, and the children had been moved to the sunroom, a space filled with soft light and carefully arranged furniture that looked more like a showroom than a place meant for living. Ethan sat quietly with a book open in his lap, though he had not turned a page in several minutes, while Mila traced circles on the glass table with her finger, her eyes drifting toward the doorway every few seconds, waiting, always waiting, And when Lena entered with a tray of sliced apples and warm grilled cheese sandwiches, the shift was immediate. Mila's shoulders relaxed. Ethan finally turned a page, and the room seemed to breathe again without anyone saying a word. Adrian stood just outside, trimming the edges of a rose bush, his movements slow, deliberate, giving himself reason to stay close, and he noticed how Lena never rushed them, never corrected them sharply. She spoke in a low, steady voice, asking simple questions, giving them space to answer, as if she understood that children did not just need food, they needed permission to feel safe, and again, they responded to her, not out of obedience, but trust. The quiet was broken when Vanessa's voice carried down the hallway before she even appeared, speaking into her phone in a tone that was carefully controlled but edged with impatience. "No, that will not work. I need everything ready by tonight," she said, her words clipped, efficient. And when she stepped into the sunroom, her smile appeared like a practiced gesture rather than a natural one. She looked at the children briefly, then at Lena. "They're not dressed yet?" she asked, though it was clear they were, and Lena answered calmly, "They just finished lunch, ma'am." But Vanessa did not respond to that. She walked closer, adjusting Mila's sleeve without asking, turning Ethan's collar slightly, as if correcting something that did not need correcting, and Adrian saw it again, that subtle withdrawal in the children, not fear exactly, but something close to it, something learned over time. "We are leaving in 20 minutes, Vanessa said. Finally, her eyes settling on Lena. "Make sure they are ready, and do not let them out of your sight until I say so." And then she was gone, her heels echoing down the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Lena did not move immediately. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, her eyes following the doorway, her expression unreadable but not empty. And then she knelt down to Mila's level, gently brushing a strand of hair away from the girl's face. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" And Mila nodded, but she did not look convinced. Ethan closed his book, looking at Lena instead of the door. "Where are we going?" he asked, and Lena hesitated, just for a moment, long enough for Adrian to notice, long enough for something in his chest to tighten. "Just a ride," she said, her voice steady again. "Nothing to worry about." But her eyes said something different, something quieter, something that did not match the calm in her tone. Outside, Adrian set down the shears, wiping his hands slowly on a cloth that had already been used too many times, his gaze fixed on the window, because now the pattern was clearer, not complete, but enough to shift something inside him, enough to make him question the one thing he trusted most, his own judgment. Because if Lena was what she appeared to be, then Vanessa was not. And if Vanessa was not, then whatever plan was unfolding inside that house had nothing to do with family, and everything to do with control. And for the first time since he chose to disappear into his own world, Adrian Vance felt the quiet edge of something he rarely allowed himself to feel: doubt. By late afternoon, the house began to change in ways that only someone watching carefully could notice, not louder, not more chaotic, but more controlled, as if every movement had been planned ahead of time, and everyone inside it was expected to follow a script they had not been given. And Adrian felt it even from outside, standing near the side entrance with a coiled garden hose in his hand, pretending to fix a nozzle that did not need fixing, because now he was no longer just observing. He was measuring every glance, every pause, every silence that lasted a second too long. A black SUV rolled quietly up the driveway, its engine barely audible, the kind of vehicle that did not announce arrival but expected to be received, and Adrian's eyes followed it through the reflection on the glass, watching as a man stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that did not belong to staff, did not belong to family either, someone in between, someone who moved like he understood boundaries but did not respect them. And Vanessa met him at the side door before anyone else could. Her posture straight, her voice lowered, but not enough to escape a man who had spent his life listening for things others tried to hide. "Everything is set," she said, her tone different now, stripped of its polished surface, revealing something sharper underneath. And the man nodded once, glancing briefly toward the hallway that led to the children's rooms. "No complications?" he asked, and Vanessa's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. Not if everyone stays where they are supposed to, and Adrian did not need more than that, because the words themselves are not the danger. It was how easily she said them, how certain she sounded, as if whatever was about to happen had already been decided long before today. Inside, Lena was helping Mila into a light jacket, her movements gentle, careful not to rush the small hands struggling with a zipper, while Ethan stood by the window, watching the driveway with a quiet intensity that did not belong to a child his age. "That is not our driver," he said suddenly, his voice low but certain, and Lena's hands paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. "Maybe plans changed," she replied softly, but her eyes flickered toward the same window, and Adrian saw it again, that hesitation, that awareness, like someone who knew more than she was willing to say out loud. "Do we have to go?" Mila asked, her voice smaller now, and Lena crouched down, meeting her at eye level. "Hey," she said, her tone steady. "I am right here, okay? I will not let anything happen." And the words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that came from someone who meant them completely. And the children believed her. Adrian could see that too, not in what they said, but in how they leaned closer to her without thinking, as if she was the only stable ground in a house that was quietly shifting beneath their feet. Vanessa's voice cut through the moment from the hallway, sharper now. "Lena, we are leaving." And this time there was no patience in it, only expectation, and Lena stood, taking Mila's hand while guiding Ethan forward with a light touch on his shoulder. But as they moved toward the door, her gaze lingered once more on the window, on the SUV, on the man waiting beside it, and something inside her seemed to settle, not fear, not panic, but decision. Outside, Adrian straightened slowly, setting the hose aside as he watched the side door open, the scene unfolding exactly as he had begun to suspect, but still not fast enough to fully understand, because now the lines were crossing, the roles no longer clear, and for the first time, he was not certain who was walking into danger, the children being led out of the house, or the woman walking with them, her grip firm, her eyes steady, carrying something no one had given her, but something she had chosen anyway, responsibility. The moment the door opened, the air outside felt colder than it should have, not because of the weather, but because something unseen had already stepped into place, waiting, and Adrian felt it in the stillness that followed, the kind of silence that did not belong to a normal afternoon, the kind that made instincts sharpen without permission. Lena guided the children down the stone steps, her grip steady, her posture calm, but her eyes never stopped moving, scanning the driveway, the unfamiliar man, the way Vanessa stood slightly behind him instead of beside him, a detail small enough to miss, but not to someone who had learned to survive by noticing what others ignored. "Right this way," the man said, his voice polite but distant, opening the rear door of the SUV as if this was all routine, as if nothing about this moment was unusual, and Vanessa nodded lightly, gesturing toward the vehicle without looking at the children directly. "Go on," she said, her tone smooth again, controlled, almost rehearsed, but Ethan did not move. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the man, then on Lena, and finally on Vanessa. And in that pause, something shifted. "This is not our car," he said again, more firmly this time, and Vanessa's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing over. "Plans change, Ethan," she replied, her voice thinner now. "Do not make this difficult." And that was when Lena made her choice. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small movement, but one that changed everything. She stepped slightly forward, placing herself just enough between the children and the open car door to slow the moment down. "Ma'am," Lena said quietly, respectful but firm. Mr. Vance did not mention any change in transportation, and the man beside the car shifted his weight, his patience thinning, while Vanessa's eyes snapped toward Lena, sharper now, colder. "You are not paid to question me," she said, each word measured. "You are paid to follow instructions." And for a second, it looked like Lena might step back, might lower her eyes and comply the way she always had. But she did not. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand tightening gently around Mila's, her voice still calm. "With respect, ma'am, I cannot take them unless I am sure it is safe." And the word safe hung in the air like something that did not belong there. something that exposed more than it should have. Adrian felt it then, not doubt anymore, not suspicion, but clarity, sharp and immediate, cutting through every assumption he had made since stepping into this role. Because Lena was not hesitating out of fear, she was resisting quietly, deliberately, and Vanessa was not annoyed. She was being interrupted, and that difference changed everything. "You are overstepping," Vanessa said, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the edge beneath it, and the man beside her glanced toward the house. Then back at Lena, as if calculating time, as if this moment was not supposed to take this long. And that was when Mila squeezed Lena's hand tighter, her small voice barely above a whisper. "I do not want to go," she said. And Lena did not look down, did not break eye contact with Vanessa. She simply answered, "You do not have to," and it was. Not a question, not a suggestion, it was a decision. The driveway fell silent. Even the faint hum of the engine seemed to disappear for a second. And Adrian stepped forward without thinking. Just one step, still in the role of a man who was not supposed to matter, but now close enough to hear every breath, every shift in tone, because whatever was about to happen next was no longer hidden behind closed doors or quiet conversations. It was here in the open, where truth had nowhere left to hide. And for the first time, the balance of power in that moment did not belong to the woman who gave orders or the man who followed them. It belonged to the one person who had nothing and still chose to stand her ground. For a moment, no one moved, not the man by the car, not Vanessa, not even the wind that had been brushing lightly through the trees just seconds before, and in that stillness, something invisible began to fracture, the kind of quiet control that only held as long as no one challenged it. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation, as if she was quickly deciding whether this resistance was worth addressing or removing. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, almost patient, the kind of tone used to disguise something sharper underneath. "Lena," she said, stepping closer, her heels clicking slowly against the stone. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." And Lena did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply adjusted her stance slightly, placing herself fully between the children and the open door, her posture calm, grounded, as if she had already accepted whatever consequence might follow. "I am only asking for confirmation, ma'am," Lena replied, her voice even controlled, but there was something new in it now, something that had not been there before, certainty, and Adrian heard it clearly, standing just a few feet away, no longer pretending to focus on the garden tools in his hand, because now every detail mattered. The man beside the vehicle exhaled slowly, glancing toward Vanessa with a subtle impatience that did not belong to a hired driver. And Adrian caught that too, the slight shift of authority, the way the man waited not for instruction, but for permission, and Vanessa gave it with a single look, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "We are already behind schedule," the man said quietly, his tone controlled but firm, and Vanessa's expression tightened just enough to confirm what Adrian already knew. This was not her operation alone. "The children are coming with us," Vanessa said, her voice returning to that polished calm. But now it carried weight, expectation, command, and for the first time, Lena shook her head, not dramatically, not defiantly, just a small, steady movement that felt louder than any raised voice. "Not without Mr. Vance's approval," she said, and the name hung in the air like a boundary no one had expected her to draw, and Adrian felt it settle inside him, heavy, undeniable, because she had just invoked a man she did not know was standing right behind her. Ethan stepped closer to Lena, his shoulder brushing against her arm, while Mila held onto her hand more tightly, and neither of them looked at Vanessa anymore. They were watching. Lena, waiting, trusting, and that trust shifted the balance further, quietly but completely. Vanessa's smile disappeared entirely now, replaced by something colder, something that did not need to pretend anymore. "You are forgetting your position," she said, her voice low, controlled, but edged with warning, and Lena's answer came without hesitation. "No, ma'am. I remember it very clearly." And she did not elaborate. She did not need to, because her position was not defined by a title or a paycheck in that moment. It was defined by what she chose to protect. Adrian took another step forward, the gravel beneath his boots barely making a sound. But it was enough to draw the man's attention, enough for Vanessa's eyes to flick briefly in his direction, dismissing him just as quickly, because to them, he was still just a gardener, still insignificant, still invisible, and that miscalculation lingered in the air like a mistake waiting to be realized. The SUV door remained open, untouched, the plan stalled, suspended in a moment no one had accounted for. And Adrian could feel it now, the tension stretching thinner with each passing second, because this was no longer about whether the children would get into the car. It was about who controlled the outcome of this moment, who had the authority to decide what happened next. And for the first time since this began, that authority did not belong to Vanessa. It did not belong to the man waiting beside the vehicle. It rested entirely in the quiet resolve of a woman who had been expected to obey, and instead chose to stand still. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching into something heavier, something that pressed against every person standing in that driveway. And Adrian felt it settle into his chest with a clarity he had not expected, because now there was no more guessing, no more watching from a distance. The truth had stepped into the open, and it was refusing to move. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her composure returning in layers, one controlled breath at a time. But beneath it, something sharper was rising, something that did not tolerate resistance for long. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but far more dangerous in its calm. "This is your final instruction," she said, looking directly at Lena now, no longer pretending otherwise. "Step aside." Lena did not respond. Immediately, she did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply tightened her hold on Mila's hand and rested her other hand lightly against Ethan's shoulder, grounding them both without needing to look at them. And when she finally spoke, her tone remained steady, unchanged. "I cannot do that," she said, and the words landed with a finality that did not invite negotiation. The man beside the SUV shifted again, this time more visibly, his patience thinning into something colder, his gaze moving past Lena to Adrian for a brief second, assessing, dismissing, calculating, and Adrian met that look without reacting, still holding onto the role that had kept him invisible until now. But inside, everything had already shifted because the situation had moved beyond observation, beyond strategy, into something far simpler and far more absolute. "We do not have time for this," the man said, his voice firmer now, and Vanessa nodded once, her decision made. "Then we stop wasting it," she replied, stepping forward again, closing the distance between herself and Lena until there was barely a foot between them. Her presence meant to intimidate, to push, to reclaim control, but Lena did not move, not an inch, her posture unchanged, her eyes level. And in that moment, it became clear that this was not defiance born from impulse. It was something chosen, something she had already committed to before stepping outside that door. Ethan shifted slightly, his voice low but clear. "We are not going," he said, echoing the certainty Lena had given him, and Mila nodded beside him, pressing closer to Lena's side, and Adrian felt it again, that shift, subtle but undeniable, because authority had quietly transferred, not through power, not through fear, but through trust, the kind that could not be commanded, only earned. Vanessa's expression hardened completely now, the last trace of her polished facade gone, replaced by something colder, more direct. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice dropping just enough to carry weight without volume. And Lena's answer came just as quietly. "No, ma'am," she said, "I am correcting one." And that was the moment everything stopped, not physically, but internally, because those words did not belong to someone unsure. They belonged to someone who had already seen enough to act. Adrian stepped forward again, this time not stopping, closing the distance until he stood just behind Lena, close enough that the children could sense him, close enough that Vanessa could no longer ignore him completely. And still she did not recognize him. Not yet. Her focus locked entirely on the obstacle in front of her, the one person she had underestimated from the beginning. The man beside the vehicle exhaled sharply, glancing once more at Vanessa, waiting, and she gave the slightest nod, a signal so small it could have been missed, but Adrian saw it clearly, And that was all he needed, because whatever came next had already been decided on their side. And now it was time for something else to be decided on his. He set the garden gloves down slowly, deliberately, letting them fall onto the stone beside him. The soft sound barely audible, but enough to mark the end of something, the end of pretending, the end of watching without acting. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but carried a weight that did not belong to a gardener. "That will not be necessary," he said. And for the first time since stepping into that role, Adrian Vance did not sound invisible at all. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the space with a quiet authority that did not belong to a man who trimmed hedges for a living. And for the first time since the standoff began, every set of eyes shifted, not toward Lena, not toward the children, but toward him. Vanessa turned slowly, her expression tightening in confusion before smoothing over into something more controlled, more careful, because now there was a variable she had not accounted for. "This does not concern you," she said, her tone measured, dismissive, but it lacked the certainty it carried just moments ago, and Adrian did not respond immediately. He stepped forward instead, closing the final gap until he stood beside Lena, not behind her anymore, not observing, not hidden, but present, fully and unmistakably present. Lena did not look at him right away, but she felt the shift, the subtle change in the air when someone who carried weight stepped into a moment, and the children felt it too. Mila's grip loosened slightly. Ethan's shoulders dropped just enough to show relief, even though neither of them fully understood why. And that was when Adrian spoke again, his voice calm, steady, but unmistakably firm. "It concerns me now," he said, and the man by the SUV straightened, his posture adjusting instinctively, as if recognizing something before his mind fully caught up to it. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him now, really looking at him for the first time, not as staff, not as background, but as something she needed to understand quickly. "You are out of line," she said, her voice sharper now, and Adrian tilted his head just slightly, as if considering the statement before letting it pass without acknowledgement, because lines, he knew, were only meaningful when both sides respected them. And in this moment, hers had already been crossed. "Close the door," Adrian said quietly, his gaze shifting briefly to the man beside the vehicle. And the command was not loud, not aggressive, but it carried something heavier than volume, something that made the man hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for Vanessa to notice, long enough for everything to change again. "You do not take orders from him," Vanessa said quickly, her control slipping at the edges now, but the man's hesitation had already spoken louder than her words, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached for the SUV door and pushed it closed, the sound soft, final, and the moment it clicked shut, the plan that had been unfolding began to collapse without anyone needing to say it out loud. Lena exhaled quietly, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition, because something had shifted in a way she could not explain, and she finally turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Adrian's for the first time, searching, questioning, but he did not answer that question. Not with words, not yet. Vanessa took a step back, recalibrating, her mind moving quickly now, trying to regain control of a situation that was no longer hers to command. "This is unnecessary," she said, her tone changing again, softer, almost conciliatory. "There has been a misunderstanding." And Adrian's expression did not change, not even slightly, because misunderstandings did not look like this. They did not arrive in black vehicles with strangers waiting by the door. They did not require children to be hurried out of their own home without explanation. "No," he said quietly, "there has not," and the simplicity of it stripped away the last layer of pretense, leaving only what was real, what had been. "They're all along." The driveway fell silent again, but this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beneath the surface, and everyone present was just now catching up to it. And in that silence, Adrian Vance finally stood exactly where he belonged, no longer hidden, no longer mistaken, and no longer willing to let someone else decide what happened next. Vanessa's smile did not return. Not this time. Instead, it settled into something thinner, more calculated, as if she was no longer trying to maintain control through appearances but through timing, through whatever she believed was still on her side. And Adrian saw it immediately, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the edge of the property, not toward the house, not toward the children, but somewhere beyond, somewhere unseen. And that single glance told him more than anything she could have said out loud. "You are overreacting," she said calmly, folding her hands in front of her, as if this were still a conversation she could manage. There was simply a change in schedule, nothing more. And her tone was almost convincing, almost enough to pass for truth if not for everything that had already happened, if not for the hesitation, the unfamiliar driver, the urgency that had not matched her words. And Adrian did not interrupt her. He simply watched, because sometimes the most revealing thing a person could do was continue speaking when the truth had already been exposed. Lena remained still beside him, her posture unchanged, but now her attention had shifted, no longer just guarding the children, but listening, measuring, her instincts aligning with something she could not yet name but clearly felt, and the children stayed close to her, their silence louder than any protest, their trust placed entirely in her presence. "Then we will wait," Adrian said finally, his voice even, unhurried, as if time itself had become something he controlled, "until everything is clear." And that was when Vanessa's composure cracked, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the smallest way, the way her fingers tightened slightly, the way her gaze sharpened just a fraction, because waiting was not part of her plan. The man beside the SUV shifted again, more noticeably now, glancing once more toward the far end of the driveway, and Adrian followed that look this time, his attention narrowing, his focus sharpening, because now he understood this was not just about taking the children somewhere. This was about timing, coordination, something that required precision, and something that was now slipping out of place. "We cannot stay here," the man said quietly, his voice lower, more urgent than before, and Vanessa responded without looking at him. "We will," she said, but there was tension in it now, resistance not just from Lena, but from the situation itself, because control was no longer centralized, it was fractured, divided, and that made everything unstable. Adrian took one more step forward, just enough to shift the center of the moment again. And this time he did not hide it, did not soften it. "You will explain," he said, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably directive, and Vanessa's eyes snapped back to him, fully focused now, no longer dismissing him, no longer underestimating him, because something in his tone had crossed a line she could not ignore. "And if I choose not to?" she asked, her voice low, testing, searching for the boundary, and Adrian held her gaze without hesitation, without anger, without raising his voice. "Then we do not move," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any threat, because it was not a negotiation, it was a condition. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint sound of something distant, a car, maybe more than one, approaching from beyond the gates, and the man beside the SUV heard it too, his posture tightening, his attention splitting, and Adrian noticed that every detail aligning now, every piece falling into place in a way that left no room for doubt, because whatever Vanessa had planned, it was no longer unfolding the way she expected, and the more it slipped, the more she revealed. Lena glanced briefly at Adrian again, her expression still calm, but now there was something else in it, understanding, not of who he was, but of what he was doing, standing there holding the moment still, refusing to let it move forward without clarity, and she mirrored it without realizing, her presence just as steady, just as immovable, and together without ever planning it. They had done something no one else in that driveway could do. They had stopped the inevitable, not with force, not with volume, but with refusal. And in that pause, that stretched, fragile silence, the truth stood exposed, not yet spoken, but no longer hidden, waiting for the next move that would decide everything. The distant sound grew clearer, no longer something imagined or easily dismissed, but real, deliberate, approaching with a steady rhythm that did not belong to chance, and Adrian did not turn his head right away. He did not need to, because he had already understood what Vanessa had been waiting for, what the man beside the SUV had been watching for, and more importantly, what had just been delayed long enough to change everything. Vanessa heard it too, and this time she did not hide it, her eyes shifting briefly toward the gate at the far end of the driveway, her posture tightening just slightly. And that was the moment her control slipped, not in words, but in timing, because whatever was supposed to happen next was no longer happening on schedule. "We are done here," she said abruptly, her voice sharper now, no longer measured, no longer patient, and she stepped forward again, reaching out as if to guide Mila toward the car. But Lena moved first, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough, a small step that closed the space completely, her hand firm around Mila's, her body angled protectively. And she did not speak this time. She did not need to. Her refusal had already been made clear. The man beside the SUV exhaled through his teeth, his calm beginning to fracture. "This is unnecessary," he said again. But now the words carried frustration instead of control, and Adrian finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the sound approaching behind them, the low hum of engines nearing the property gates. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but it carried something else now, certainty. "You are right," Adrian said quietly. "This is unnecessary." And the way he said it shifted the meaning entirely. Not agreement, but conclusion. Vanessa looked at him sharply, her eyes narrowing, trying to recalibrate, trying to understand how much he knew, how much he had seen. And for the first time, there was something else there, something she had not allowed before, uncertainty. "You do not understand what is happening," she said, her voice lower now, almost controlled again. But Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "I understand enough," he replied, and he did not elaborate because he did not need to, not anymore. The sound of the approaching vehicles grew louder, tires moving over gravel beyond the gates, controlled, coordinated, not rushed, but intentional, and the man beside the SUV straightened fully now, his attention splitting between Vanessa and the direction of the sound, his earlier confidence thinning into something more cautious. Lena felt it too, the shift in the air, the subtle change that told her something outside this moment was about to enter it, and she tightened her hold on the children just slightly, grounding them without panic, her voice soft but steady. "Stay close," she said, and both Ethan and Mila nodded without question, their trust unbroken. Vanessa took a step back this time, not forward, her mind moving quickly, adjusting, recalculating, because whatever advantage she believed she had was no longer certain, and the space she had controlled minutes ago now felt unstable beneath her. Adrian took one final step forward, positioning himself clearly between Lena and Vanessa, not shielding, not overtly, but enough to define the line that had been drawn. And when he spoke again, there was no trace of the gardener left in his voice. "No one is going anywhere," he said, and the words settled into the moment with a finality that did not invite challenge. The gates at the end of the driveway began to open, slowly, deliberately, the sound of metal moving against metal echoing faintly through the quiet, and every person standing there felt it, not just as a sound, but as a shift, as the moment tipping from uncertainty into something irreversible, because whatever arrived through those gates would not just change the situation, it would reveal it completely. Vanessa's eyes flicked once more toward the entrance, then back to Adrian. And for the first time since this began, she did not speak because now even she understood the moment she had been controlling had already slipped beyond her reach, and whatever came next would no longer be hers to decide. The gates did not open quickly. They opened with intention, slow enough that every second stretched, every sound amplified, the faint grind of metal echoing across the driveway, like a signal that something long hidden was finally stepping into the light. And Adrian did not move, not even slightly, his posture steady, his presence anchored in the center of the moment, as if he had been waiting for this exact point all along. The first vehicle rolled through, dark, polished, familiar in a way the earlier SUV had not been, followed by a second, then a third, each one moving with quiet precision before coming to a stop along the edge of the drive. And the difference was immediate, not louder, not more aggressive, but heavier, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood. The man beside Vanessa saw it first, really saw it, and his shoulders shifted in a way he could not fully control. The confidence that had carried him just minutes ago now replaced by something tighter, more cautious, and Vanessa noticed that too, her eyes flicking toward him, then back to Adrian, the pieces aligning too late. Doors opened, not hurried, not chaotic, but deliberate, and men stepped out, composed, alert, not looking at Vanessa, not looking at the children, their attention fixed entirely on Adrian, and that was when everything changed completely. Lena felt it before she understood it, the shift in the air, the way the children instinctively leaned closer to her, but did not pull away, because for the first time, the tension around them was no longer rising, it was settling, and she looked at Adrian again, really looked this time, not at the worn jacket, not at the dirt on his hands, but at the stillness in him, the control, the quiet authority that did not belong to someone invisible. Vanessa took a step back, her composure fracturing in a way she could no longer hide. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharper now, but it no longer carried command, only demand, and Adrian finally turned to face her fully. No hesitation, no disguise left in the way he held himself, in the way he spoke. "It is over," he said simply, and the words did not rise, did not fall. They landed, final, unshakable, and for a moment, no one responded, because there was nothing left to challenge them with. The man beside the SUV glanced toward the newly arrived vehicles, then back at Vanessa, waiting for instruction that did not come, because for the first time since this began, she did not have one. Her plan, whatever it had been, had already unraveled in the space between hesitation and delay. Lena's grip on Mila softened slightly, not releasing, just enough to reassure, and Ethan stepped half a step forward, his eyes fixed on Adrian now, something like recognition forming, not of identity, but of role, of understanding who, in this moment, was in control. Adrian took one step forward, just one, and it was enough to shift the entire balance of the driveway, because now he was no longer standing beside Lena, he was standing in front of everything, between what had been planned and what would actually happen next. "You brought strangers into my home," he said, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably edged with something deeper, not anger, but something far more controlled, far more precise, and expected no one to notice. And Vanessa's lips parted slightly, her response delayed by the realization settling in front of her, because now she understood, not just that she had been stopped, but that she had been seen completely, from the beginning. The men who had arrived remained still, silent, waiting, not for instruction from Vanessa, not for movement from the stranger beside the SUV, but for Adrian, and that silence confirmed what words had not yet fully declared, that the power in this moment had never truly left him. It had only been hidden, waiting for the exact second it needed to return. Lena looked from Adrian to the men, then back to him again, and in her eyes, something shifted, not fear, not confusion, but understanding, the quiet realization that the man she had stood beside, the man she had unknowingly trusted in that moment, was not what he had seemed, and yet, somehow, that did not change what mattered most, that he had stepped forward when it counted. Vanessa stood still now, no longer advancing, no longer directing, her position reduced not by force, but by exposure, and the driveway fell into a different kind of silence, one that did not wait for the next move, because the outcome had already arrived, standing in plain sight, undeniable and final. No one spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed, and the weight of that realization settled over the driveway like a quiet verdict. Vanessa stood still, her posture no longer controlled but held together by effort, her eyes moving from Adrian to the men behind him, then back. Again, searching for something she could still use, some angle, some leverage, but there was none left, only the truth standing plainly in front of her. "You planned this," she said finally, her voice lower now. Not sharp, not demanding, but edged with something closer to disbelief, and Adrian did not answer immediately, because the question itself missed the point entirely. "No," he said after a moment, his tone steady. "You did," and the simplicity of it stripped away the last illusion she had been holding on to, because this was not about a trap, not about strategy, it was about choice, hers, and the consequences that followed it. The man beside the SUV took a step back, subtle but unmistakable, distancing himself from a situation that was no longer his to manage, and Adrian's men remained still, silent, their presence unchanged, because nothing more needed to be done. Not yet. Lena stood where she had been all along, her hand still wrapped gently around Mila's, Ethan close at her side, and for the first time since stepping outside, her shoulders eased just slightly, not in relief, but in understanding, because the tension that had been building was no longer moving forward. It had reached its end. Adrian turned his head slightly toward her, just enough for their eyes to meet again. And this time there was no distance in it, no disguise left between them. Only acknowledgement, quiet and unspoken. And then he looked back at Vanessa. "You will explain everything," he said, not as a demand, not as a threat, but as a certainty, and Vanessa's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came, because for the first time, she did not control the narrative. She was part of it. The wind moved softly through the trees again, carrying away the last of the tension that had filled the air, and the estate, which had felt tight, controlled, almost suffocating just minutes ago, seemed to open again, the weight lifting not because the situation had resolved completely, but because the truth was no longer hidden. Lena glanced down at Mila, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, her movements gentle, instinctive, and Mila leaned into her without hesitation, while Ethan looked up at Adrian, studying him in silence, as if trying to understand how the quiet man in the garden had become the center of everything. Adrian noticed it, the way the boy watched him, and something in his expression shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would see, but enough to register, enough to matter. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, the fight in her posture fading into something else, something quieter, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had changed completely, stripped of control, stripped of pretense. "You do not understand what this required," she said, not as a defense, but as a statement, and Adrian held her gaze unmoved. "Then help me understand," he replied, and there was no urgency in it, no pressure, only expectation, the kind that did not need to be enforced because it was already accepted. The driveway remained still, the vehicles silent, the men waiting, but the moment had shifted entirely from confrontation to revelation, from resistance to truth, and Lena stood in the center of it all, exactly where she had been from the beginning, not because she had sought it, but because she had refused to step away when it mattered most. And as Adrian looked at her once more, just briefly, he understood something that had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with control, something far simpler and far more difficult to earn, that the person who had held this moment together was not the one who commanded it, but the one who chose to stand her ground when no one else would. Vanessa's words did not linger in the air the way her earlier commands had. They did not carry authority anymore. Only the weight of someone trying to justify a decision that could no longer be undone. And Adrian heard it clearly. Not just what she said, but what she avoided saying, the gaps between her words, the silence where truth should have been. "Then start with the part where you decided to move my children without telling me," he said, his voice calm, measured, but no longer distant, no longer observing. This was direct now, undeniable, and Vanessa held his gaze for a moment before looking away, just briefly, just enough to reveal something she had not intended to show. "They would have been safer," she replied, and the choice of words shifted everything again, not because of what it claimed, but because of what it assumed, that she had the right to decide, that she knew better, that her judgment stood above his, and Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his stillness deepened. "Safer from what?" he asked, and this time, the question did not leave her room to maneuver, because it demanded clarity, and clarity was exactly what she had been avoiding. The man beside the SUV lowered his gaze slightly, stepping another half step back, distancing himself further from the center of the moment, as if even he understood that whatever explanation came next would not belong to him. Lena remained silent, but her attention sharpened, her focus no longer just on the children, but on Vanessa now, listening because whatever answer came would not just explain what had happened. It would explain why she had felt something was wrong before anyone else did. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her composure no longer something she could rely on, but something she was holding together deliberately, piece by piece. There are people watching this house, she said finally, her voice quieter now, more controlled, but no longer polished. People who would use your children to get to you. And Adrian did not interrupt. He let her continue, because this was the first time she had spoken without performance. I arranged for them to be moved somewhere secure, temporarily, she added. And the word arrange hung in the air like something heavier than it should have been, because it did not match what they had all just witnessed. Adrian's gaze did not waver. Without telling me, he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and Vanessa's silence answered it more clearly than words could. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying away the last tension that had filled the space, and Lena looked down briefly at Mila. Then at Ethan, both of them still close, still calm, because whatever fear had been there earlier had already begun to fade, replaced by something steadier, something grounded in the presence beside them. You did not trust me, Adrian said quietly, and Vanessa's head lifted slightly, her eyes meeting his again. I trusted the situation, she replied, but even she seemed to hear the flaw in that answer as it left her lips. Adrian nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something already understood. And in doing so, he said, his voice steady, you created the very risk you claimed to prevent. And that was where her argument ended, not with force, not with contradiction, but with the quiet recognition that her reasoning could not hold against what had actually happened. Lena shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not drawing attention, but her presence remained constant, the children still anchored to her. And Adrian glanced at her again, just for a moment, enough to register what she had done without ever announcing it. She had not panicked. She had not escalated. She had simply refused to let something wrong continue, and that had been enough to change everything. Vanessa lowered her gaze again, her posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but something else entirely, something closer to realization. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer than it had been at any point before. I was trying to protect what matters, she said. And Adrian did not respond immediately, because protection, he knew, was not defined by intention, but by action. And in that moment, the difference between the two stood clearly in front of him, not in what had been planned, but in who had actually chosen to stand between the children and something they did not understand. And as his gaze returned to Lena once more, it was no longer just observation, it was acknowledgement. For a long moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because the moment itself had already reached its conclusion, and all that remained was to accept it, to stand in it, to understand what it meant. Vanessa lowered her gaze fully this time, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that came too late to change anything. And Adrian did not press further, did not raise his voice, did not demand more than what had already been revealed, because the truth did not need force to stand, it only needed to be seen. He turned slightly, just enough to shift his focus away from her and toward the children, and the change in his expression was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, the edge of control softening, not disappearing, but giving way to something else, something quieter. Ethan looked up at him, still studying, still processing, and Mila leaned into Lena without hesitation, her small hand still wrapped around the woman who had never once let go, and Adrian saw that clearly now, not as an observation, but as something undeniable, something that could not be explained away or ignored. He stepped closer, not toward Vanessa, not toward the man by the vehicle, but toward Lena and the children, closing the distance that had existed all day, not as a test, not as an experiment, but as a decision, and when he stopped, it was just within reach, just enough to shift the center of the moment once more. You can take them inside, he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying the weight of confrontation, but something steadier, something protective, and Lena hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty, because now she understood, now she saw what had been hidden before, and yet she did not question it. She simply nodded once. her grip on Mila's softening as she guided both children gently back toward the house. Ethan paused for a second, glancing back at Adrian as if trying to confirm something unspoken, and Adrian met his gaze with a calm steadiness that did not need explanation, and the boy nodded slightly before turning to follow Lena inside, the door closing quietly behind them, leaving the driveway still once again. Adrian remained where he was, watching the door for a brief moment longer than necessary, as if ensuring something had truly settled before turning back. And when he did, there was nothing left of the gardener in him, no trace of disguise, only the man who had always been there, waiting, observing, deciding. Vanessa stood a few feet away, her posture no longer guarded, no longer resistant, but still as if she understood that whatever came next would not be argued. And the man beside the SUV had already stepped back completely, his presence reduced to something peripheral, no longer central to anything that mattered. Adrian did not step closer to her, did not raise his voice. He simply spoke, his tone even controlled, final. "You will leave," he said, and there was no anger in it, no threat, only resolution, the kind that did not require emphasis because it would not be challenged. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, and whatever response she might have had remained unspoken, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to justify, only the consequence of a choice that had already unfolded. She turned without another word, moving toward the vehicle that had arrived for a plan that would never be completed, and the man followed without hesitation, the door opening and closing with a quiet finality that echoed more than any raised voice could have. The vehicles remained for a moment longer. Then one by one, they began to move, leaving the driveway as quietly as they had arrived, until there was nothing left but the soft sound of wind through the trees and the stillness of a place returning to itself. Adrian stood alone for a moment, his gaze drifting back toward the house, toward the door that had just closed, and in that silence, something shifted, not in the world around him, but within it, something he had not expected to find, not in power, not in control, but in the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to gain and still chose to stand. And as he turned to walk back toward the house, there was no urgency in his steps, no hesitation either, only a steady understanding that things could not be commanded, only recognized. And that day, without anyone announcing it, without anyone needing to say it out loud, the world inside those walls had remembered what dignity looked like.